Good afternoon. I'm Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library. I am so delighted to see this really good turnout for our first History Talk, Tuesday with a Scholar History Talk for the winter season in 2019. Today our speaker is Kristal Leebrick, who has written a book on the great department stores of yore. This has certainly proved to be one of the most popular history titles in the library lately, and I can see by the size of the crowd that it's a great topic. But it's not the only topic. We're going to have a lot of interesting history talks this winter. Next week we'll have Ed Lauterman, who many of you know from previous speaking occasions here. Ed is the Common Sense Economics columnist, I think it is, for the Pioneer Press. He's going to be talking about what he calls the Pa Ingalls syndrome. That is Pa Ingalls from Little House on the Prairie, what he calls the push-pull syndrome, why your immigrant ancestor ended up moving where he or she did. So don't miss it. Ed has a great style. Then the following Tuesday, we're going to have the Minnesota History Theater will be here in this space with some cast members from their current production about, I can't remember the title now, but I think it's Stewardess, yeah, about young women in the airline industry in the 20th century. The hint is it was a pretty sexist time and a pretty sexist industry, and I'm sure they'll be talking about that, as well as very glamorous as well. But now we're going to get ready to listen to Kristal Leebrick, but I want to say that these talks are brought to you by our Legacy Amendment, that is Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, and we could not do them without the support of our great partners in this, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of the University of Minnesota. For those of you who are not familiar with that fine organization and would be interested perhaps in going to programs like this, I believe they have programs at about 37 different venues in the area. We have a representative, a course assistant from Ollie here. Martha, you want to stand up? Or yeah. Speak to Martha. She can tell you all about the organization. For anyone looking for the restroom, it's right across the hall on the other side of the lobby. And now I'm going to turn the podium over to Kristal Leebrick. Thank you.
Now we get, okay, now it's on. Thanks, Judy. No, that's fine.
Okay.
Wow. First, I'm going to get a drink of water because I'm a little nervous because the title scholar in this kind of frightens me a little bit. Because I'm not a scholar, I'm just a curious human being who spent the last couple years learning a lot about Minnesota's department stores, which I kind of get the impression that most everybody here probably misses all of those department stores. I've talked to a few people before, and I always say this because it's true, but don't you wish that we were like in the Sky Room at Dayton's right now, or the River Room, or in the Fountain Room at Young Quinlan's? Which I was never in. I was never in the Fountain Room at Young Quinlan's. I hate to tell you that. I wish we could go back in time. But we can't. What was your favorite department store? Let's see a show of hands. Young Quinlan? Powers? Oh, not too many. How about Donaldson's? All right, Dayton's. Yeah. But what about Schooneman's? Come on, you guys are St. Paul people. The Emporium? The Golden Rule. Did any of you work at any of these stores? Yeah, quite a few of you. One thing I learned when I worked on this book is that Minnesotans love their hometown department stores, and it seems like everyone has a story about either shopping at the stores, working at the stores, or just checking out all the fabulous window displays in a bustling downtown. A bustling downtown. Seems like a really long time ago, doesn't it? Who remembers where they were when the Target Corporation announced that they were changing the name of all their Dayton stores to Marshall Fields? It was just 17 years ago. 17 years ago, the name that had been part of the state's retail vernacular for nearly 100 years. Dayton's the last homegrown department store in Minnesota ended. It was gone. In a Star Tribune article, at that time, Lee Lynch of Carmichael Lynch Advertising told writer Kristen Tillotson that in 20 years, 20% of the population would still be calling the stores Dayton's. I hope he's right, Tillotson wrote, but in a generation or two, children will return from visiting Grandma to ask, Daddy, what's a Dayton's? No kidding. I was last fall when this book was getting ready to come out, I was talking to a 21-year-old college student about Dayton's and about, the different department stores, but when I talked about Dayton's, she said she'd never heard of it. She grew up in Minnesota, about an hour south of the Twin Cities, 21 years old, and had never heard of Dayton's department store. I was amazed. Who didn't? I mean, I know she's 21 years old, but how could she not have heard of Dayton's department store? And so, as we talked a little bit more, all of a sudden she stops and she goes, "Wait, does that have anything to do with our governor?" See, the grandkids are asking, "What's a Dayton's?" Whoops, I just went the wrong way. Sorry, guys. So everybody here knows what a department store is, and I'm sure that everyone in this room has a story to tell about either their experiences from their favorite department store. For more than a century, these stores were institutions in our state, and they touched people's lives in many, many ways. For many, it was a first job, the place you bought your wedding dress, riding the train at Christmas time in Donaldson's Toyland. Does anybody remember that? Yeah. How about this? Pining for the dress that Twiggy wore when she visited Dayton's in 1967. Having lunch at young Quinlan's fountain room after visiting your obstetrician in the nearby medical arts building. That's a placemat from the fountain room. How about browsing Power's fabulous bookstore, which everybody talked about, or their shoe store? I mean, this is an old picture, but, or heading downtown on Thanksgiving evening to see the Christmas displays in the store windows. Yeah. One of my favorite stories in this book was told to me by a friend, Sarah Massey. Her two feisty older sisters, in the late 1950s, they loved taking the bus downtown from their house in South Minneapolis. They'd take their baby dolls with them, and they'd take the bus downtown, and they'd go play house in the furniture showrooms on Dayton's 4th floor. And I guess they were quite the characters. So they loved to tool around in the dining rooms, the living rooms, the bedrooms, until the salespeople there said, "Out of here." And then they'd go to the fur department and try on coats until they were kicked out of there. And then when they got kicked out of all the different places that they were horsing around in, they'd go upstairs to the now I forgot what floor it was on. I got to look at my notes, sorry. But they go upstairs to the executive offices where their mom's best friend, Maud Peterson, worked for Donald Dayton. And they'd go up there and they'd say, "You want to take us to lunch?" And she always did. And so they'd go up to the Sky Room and have an elegant lunch with their mom's best friend. And those spontaneous lunches kept up until their mom found out. And then was horrified and said, "Okay, you're done." Anyway, what I love about that story is, well, number one, who didn't want to play house in those furniture showrooms when you were a kid? Honestly, And then the other thing I love about that story is these South Minneapolis girls felt at home at 700 Nicollet Avenue, as did many, many people. Anyway, I love that story. And that's what my book, what I discovered is really the department store history is really our history, our own personal history. Mary Jensen grew up in St. Paul and never shopped at Schooneman's. It was the high-end department store in downtown St. Paul was out of her price range. Then in 1958, she was married, had 2 children, and she won a contest on the B. Baxter Show, a daytime TV show on KSTP. Does anybody remember the B. Baxter Show? You know, I've talked a couple times, and you're the only person who said that you remember the B. Baxter Show. Anyway, I guess B. Baxter had this contest where she asked viewers to write in and write about something they'd like to do to improve themselves. So she wrote a letter that she'd like to lose weight and to feel better about herself, and she won the contest, and she was brought on the show for 6 weeks, once a week for 6 weeks, and they brought these people on to give her diet tips. Things she says now were really horrible pieces of advice. But she did lose 20 pounds, and then she won this was 1958. She won a $250 wardrobe from Schooneman's, 5 new dresses, a navy blue suit, new gloves, new purse, new hat and shoes, and all the undergarments to go with it. So, and then shortly after that, she started working as an accountant for the state, so that was a very handy thing. These are pictures from Schooneman's. I don't have any good pictures from the inside or the outside of Schooneman's, which is unfortunate. Okay, I have one more story for you, another one of my favorite stories. It was spring 1965 when Stuart Wells, Dayton's vice president of merchandising and publicity at the time, told Dolores DeFore to get on a plane to London immediately to check out the new fashions. He just returned from a trip there and saw some wild new things and said, Dolores, get over there now. And within a couple days, she was on a plane and she landed at Heathrow. And she toured all the trendy boutiques on Carnaby Street and the showrooms of designers Mary Quant, Angela Cash, and Gerald McCann. Does that mean anything to any of you out there? Yeah, I know. Anyway, the skirts were short, and so were the hairstyles, and the clothes were so cute, Dolores told me. And they looked cute on everybody. Dolores managed a contract with those designers to come back to Minneapolis that August for Dayton's back-to-school promotions, and a few weeks after her London visit, she was in New York at a buyers meeting, and she was asked to talk about her little visit to London, and she got up there and she was talking, and she was telling them how she had got those 3 designers to come to Dayton's in August, and apparently the room went empty. Those buyers got out of that room fast to go try and get a phone and get a hold of those people to come to their stores for the back-to-school promotions. She said it was the most fun thing in her whole career, and this is from a woman who went on to become one of the first divisional managers at Dayton's and later president and co-owner of Herald in Minneapolis. Dolores DeFore brought the London look to Minneapolis in 1965, and Dayton's promoted it with fashion shows featuring live music and dancing models, concerts by Simon and Garfunkel, the Chad Mitchell Trio, and the Yardbirds. Anybody go to any of that? The store even had a Beatles look-alike band from Liverpool come and play each day in the junior department. But now I'm going to take you a little ways back, 150 years, for just a little bit of early department store history. Minnesota's department stores began as dry goods stores established by European settlers that, as they began moving west after the Civil War, they sold everything the pioneers needed: pots and pans, fabric and wool, boots, and food. The store that claimed to be the first department store west of the Mississippi got its start in 1861. Hannibal Choate opened Choate's cheap cash store in a muddy steamboat landing called Winona. Is anybody here from Winona? Do you remember Choate's? Yep. I mean, yep, the building is still there, and a woman named Lynn Hartert owns it now, and she has a gift store there called a Heart's Desire, right? Brothers William and Lawrence Donaldson came to Minneapolis from Scotland in 1880, and they set up shop on Nicollet Avenue in this unique-looking 1.5-story building, which was called the Glass Block Store, which was named for its large number of plate glass windows. When the store had its grand opening, the Donaldsons set off gunpowder explosions from the top of the building and offered free trolley rides to the new store. So what was it like to work in those stores back then? Here are the store rules from Donaldson's from 1882, word for word. This store must be opened at sunrise, no mistake. Open 6 o'clock a.m. summer and winter, close about 8:30 or 9 p.m. the year round. The store is not opened on the Sabbath day unless absolutely necessary, and only for a few minutes. Should the store be opened on Sunday, the clerks must go in alone and get tobacco for customers in need. The clerk who is in the habit of smoking Spanish cigars, being shaved at the barber's, going to dancing parties and other places of amusement, and being out late at night will assuredly give his employer reason to be ever suspicious of his integrity and honesty. Clerks are allowed to smoke in the store, provided they do not wait on women with a stogie in the mouth. Each clerk must not pay less than $5 per year to the church and must attend Sunday school regularly. Men clerks are given 1 evening a week off for courting and 2 if he goes to prayer meeting. And after the 14 hours in the store, the leisure hours should be spent mostly in reading or sleeping. Not quite what it's like today, is it? Within 4 years of the glass block's grand opening, the Donaldson brothers had demolished the small building and replaced it with a 5-story skyscraper. By 1891, the glass block employed 475 people, had 150,000 mail order customers, and had buying offices in New York, London, and Paris. I thought that was fascinating. 1891, they had buying offices in London and Paris. The last 2 decades, also, one thing I want to bring up, which is not in my little typed up sheets of paper, the dome on top of Donaldson's, I suspect, does anybody here remember? It came down during World War II, so I suspect most of you wouldn't remember that. But anyway, it was the iconic dome. It came down when they were collecting metal during the war. And anyway, that building, of course, no longer exists. It burned down in the 1980s, I think. So the last 2 decades of the 19th century was a time of great progress for merchants in the Twin Cities. The mercantile that would later become Powers got its start in 1881. Across the river in St. Paul that same year, Schunemann and Evans opened, and then the Golden Rule was established 5 years later. And I'm going to pause here for a minute so you can read this very early advertisement that was found in a St. Paul paper, or I could read it to you. Important notice to mothers. Our toys are on the main floor, so to speak. In connection with our toy department, we have an elegant toilet and washroom for ladies and children in charge of a competent and trained nurse. Beware of dangerous elevators. You are liable to have one or all of your children killed by the breaking loose of one of these death traps. See the daily papers and you will read about horrible elevator accidents all over the country, 2 in Minneapolis last month. Or in case of panic, you will have to throw your children out of a 4-story building to the sidewalk. We have no elevators. Thank you. I can't interpret that. I'm not. Anyway, so then in 1894, Fred Young and Elizabeth Quinlan left their jobs at Goodfellow Dry Goods in Minneapolis and established Young Quinlan. It was one of the first stores in the country to sell ready-to-wear clothing for women. The only other store doing that at the time was in New York City. See, that's a second reference telling you that Minneapolis, sorry, I know we're in Roseville and I should be saying St. Paul, but it was Minneapolis beat the New York stores many, many, many times over. Anyway, back to the ready-to-wear. The dry goods stores, used to sell material and notions and things for you to make your own clothing or hire a dressmaker to make your clothing. So this was pretty big deal for a woman to be able to walk into a store and have a piece of clothing already made that she could try on. When Elizabeth Quinlan began her career as a clerk at Goodfellows, she was told by old man Goodfellow that she would never make more than $10 a week because, quote, That is all women are worth, he said. So much for old man Goodfellow. Elizabeth Quinlan became the first woman merchandise buyer in the United States, and by 1926, she built a $1.25 million 5-story building at 9th and Nicollet. It is a beautiful Renaissance revival building that featured a marble staircase, crystal chandeliers, and an underground parking garage with an elevator that took patrons directly from the garage to the sales floors. And as many of you know, that building still exists today, though it's not a department store. So, one of my more surprising things I learned in my research about all this is 2 decades after Donaldson's and Powers got their start, George Draper Dayton opened a 6-story building at 7th and Nicollet. Dayton convinced Goodfellow Dry Goods, the place where Elizabeth Quinlan got her start, to move into the building. And at the time, Goodfellow's was the 4th largest department store in the city. Dayton became a silent partner of the business, but after a year, he bought out the other owners, and the company's name changed from Goodfellow's to Dayton's Dry Goods. And if you look at this picture, you can kind of see that, you can see where it says Dayton's, and right below it, it says Goodfellow's. And I think that stayed there like for almost a year until it transitioned from Goodfellow's to Dayton's. The store was just across the intersection from Donaldson's, and those 2 enterprises were rivals for the next 8 decades. George Dayton, the patriarch of the Dayton family, he was a banker from Worthington who never intended to be a merchant, but yet he seemed to have a knack for publicity. In the early 1900s, he staged publicity stunts that included hiring airplanes to deliver goods to out-of-town visitors who had ordered items at the Minnesota State Fair. In 1920, he dropped foot-long red, blue, and yellow feathers that bore the Dayton name over 88 county fairs. That same year, he took advantage of an express handler's rail strike in New York and hired 2 pilots from Curtis Northwest Airplane Company, which was headquartered near here, right by the state fairgrounds, and had them fly to New York to pick up 800 pounds of merchandise. They flew the merchandise back to Minnesota, landed at Parade Stadium near downtown Minneapolis, took the wings off the planes, and drove the planes down Nicollet Avenue to Dayton's. And of course, the press was at the ready to document the whole publicity stunt. By 1922, Dayton celebrated its 20th anniversary with a 1-day Golden Jubilee sale where the store doubled its inventory, slashed its prices, and promoted the sale so heavily that Dayton's pushed Donaldson's out of the #1 retail spot in the region. The Jubilee sale became an annual event, as many of you know, and Donaldson's never regained that #1 standing. When George Dayton's grandsons, Donald, or I should say Mr. Donald, Mr. Bruce, Mr. Kenneth, Mr. Douglas, and Mr. Wallace, because if you worked there, that's what you called them, if anybody recalls that. When they took over the store in 1950, they brought with them their grandfather's penchant for marketing. I think the Daytons were pretty amazing when it came to marketing their store. The Dayton Company opened a Rochester store in 1952, and in 1956, Southdale, the first climate-controlled indoor mall, opened in Edina. Dayton's invited its chief competitor, Donaldson's, to be one of the anchor stores, and Donaldson's was an anchor store at all of the Dales that followed. Dayton's opened stores in St. Paul. They built a new store after they'd bought Schooneman's, and then they bought a new piece of property and built a new store in downtown St. Paul, which I'm sure many of you visited. And they opened one in South Dakota, and in 1962, the Dayton Company opened its first Target right down the street from here in Roseville. And through all this expansion, Dayton's, the management realized that it needed to find something to bring people back down to the flagship store because people were out in the suburbs. And so in 1963, they moved the housewares and hardware department and the exotic pet shop. And there you go. In the late 1950s, early 1960s, there was an exotic pet shop, including monkeys, on the 8th floor of of the Dayton's building, and I don't know if any of you recall last spring. You worked there in the pet shop? So do you know where that monkey came from that they found last spring? Oh, that's funny. Last spring, for those of you who don't know, that the people who are renovating the building, the Dayton's project, they found a dried up monkey carcass in a vent on the 8th floor, and so there was a lot of reports about where it might have come from. But anyway, here's proof that they actually did have monkeys on the 8th floor. So Dayton's moved all that out of the 8th floor, and they created a 13,000 square foot walnut paneled auditorium that would become one of the most happening spots in the Twin Cities. Its first floor event was the Minnesota Rose Society's National Rose Show in October 1963. Ralph Bachman of the Bachman Family Nurseries was co-chairman of the event. Thousands of flowers were flown to Minneapolis from commercial growers in Europe, Canada, Australia, and Mexico, and all 4 corners of the United States. Minneapolis Tribune columnist George Grimm wrote that it was the most spectacular fusing of flowers he'd ever seen, and it was free for the thousands of people who came to visit it. That 8th floor auditorium became the place for Saturday afternoon teen dances, concerts by local and national rock bands, and fashion shows featuring the latest teen trends. Did anybody go to those dances? Some? Yeah, yay! I mean, that just sounds wonderful. They had these free dances every Saturday for teenagers, down in that auditorium. Anyway, they even had a circus up there one time featuring elephants and ponies and poodles and seals and leopards. Does anybody remember that? How about the dance happenings, which is different than the dances they had for the young kids? Apparently, in 1967, Dayton's transformed the auditorium into a simulated LSD trip. Not kidding. With lights, music, sounds, and images projected from slides and cameras aimed at creating a psychedelic experience. And I tried really hard to find pictures of that for this book, but apparently they kind of buried that little piece of history. I don't know, but anyway. When asked why Dayton's did this, the special events director at the time, Thomas Jaglowski, said, "It was just part of Dayton's mission of being a trend-setting store." When I talked with Todd Knabley, who managed the 8th floor special events for almost 3 decades, up until the closing, including during the time that Dayton's transitioned to Marshall Field's and then Macy's, he said that the Macy's stores in other cities were jealous of the auditorium here. None of the other stores, including the Herald Square Macy's in New York or the former Marshall Field's on State Street in downtown Chicago, had an auditorium like that. And those 8th floor Christmas shows, whoops, did I skip that? Sorry, I went too fast. The 8th floor Christmas shows and spring flower shows, which took place in that auditorium for more than half a century, were pretty amazing. Todd described them as totally immersive. Visitors were transported to Vienna, London, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Bourbon Street in New Orleans, Monet's Garden. I remember this one very well. Todd's favorite show, Pinocchio in 1991. You really felt like you were walking down the street of a small Italian town with beautiful architecture, he told me. You could be looking at scene 1 and you'd see down the street and into the alley and something would bring you there and you wanted to just keep on going to see what was next. Painter and sculptor Dan Mackerman worked all through the night during the 1991 Halloween blizzard. Everybody remembers that, right? He took a chainsaw to giant blocks of styrofoam to create the 30-foot whale for the Pinocchio show, which Todd described as beautiful. It had Pinocchio on a raft inside Monstro, the whale's mouth, and fish swimming in water below him. It was really wild, Todd said. And it was, look at that. This is styrofoam. That's how they made those things. I think one of the things when I think about the golden age or just the age of department stores, what I miss most is the extravaganza and the events that these stores brought to our communities. There were author talks and lectures. This is from does it say up there, 1916 at Powers. The special exhibits, an African Violet show, the fashion shows, and of course the store windows. But what remains with us, though, is, these founders left a legacy here in Minnesota, and when you look back at the founders of department stores, they were the pillars of our communities throughout the state of Minnesota. And Brainerd, Minnesota had O'Brien's Mercantile for many, many, many decades. Tom O'Brien, president of O'Brien Mercantile Company in the mid-20th century, he carried on his grandfather's legacy, but he did more than just run a store. He founded the Brainerd Broadcasting Company, served as vice chairman of the American Red Cross Fund Campaign, and served on the Minnesota State School Board. And he was mayor of the town a couple different times. In the 1950s, he established a program that brought foreign students to Brainerd to discuss international issues and give, quote, one half of an idea of how the other half lives. In 1956, students from 61 other countries visited Brainerd as part of that program. Retailers like Donaldson's and Powers also cared deeply about community. In 1913, Donaldson's launched a plan to buy homes to house single working women to draw more employees from rural Minnesota. 5 years later, Powers received high marks from the Minneapolis Labor Review for holding classes each morning to educate employees of limited means and help them get their high school educations. And of course, there's the Dayton's legacy. In 1946, the Dayton Company began setting aside 5% of its pre-tax income for charitable purposes. And after 30 years of continued giving, Dayton's was founding member of the 5% Club, a group established in 1976 by 23 Minnesota companies to encourage charitable giving in the state. I chose to put that picture up here, and I've got this little backpack here, and Judy, I don't know if you remember this, but because we have children the same age, but when my daughter was in kindergarten, she was going into kindergarten in 1996, the principal from our school over in St. Paul, not very far from here, knocked on our door right before school started and showed up with that backpack. Actually, it wasn't that backpack. That one looks way nicer than it would have, but they gave, for years and years, Dayton's gave every incoming kindergarten kid in Minneapolis and St. Paul in the public schools a backpack. I don't know. I was impressed. The Dayton Company, as we know, was pivotal in the start of many institutions in the Twin Cities. The Guthrie, the Minnesota Orchestra, the Walker Arts Center, St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, Minnesota Public Radio, and even the Minnesota Historical Society, which had its hand in publishing this book. In a conversation I had several years ago with Judy Dayton, the wife of Kenneth Dayton, she commented that it was a two-way street. The Daytons were grateful to be a part of the community and truly believed they got back just about as much as they gave. And Minnesota was pretty lucky to have all these merchants to help to give us so many cultural institutions that we value today. I mean, really, we would not have what we have without all of these merchants who came 150 years ago to share their wealth and help establish our cultural institutions. Anyway, that's it. That's what I have to tell you. And I guess if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. But also, if you have a story to tell, like working with the fish on the 8th floor of Dayton's.
And we're all eager to hear your questions and your stories, but let me bring you the microphone so that everybody can hear everything. Who wants to start? Who's got their hand up? Hand? Anybody? Oh, yes, here we go.
I'm always too talkative. The fish story, but I was born in Manhattan, and I came to Minneapolis in '55 at age 15, and I remember buying my dad taking me to buy my first suit, We were living 70 miles west of the city. But you haven't mentioned jesters. I think they were a big part of the men's environment for the department store. That was where you bought a suit if you weren't trying to buy a cheap suit.
Yeah, I did not mention jesters. You know, my project, we ended up just concentrating on department stores just because it began to be unwieldy, you know. But no, I had heard of jesters. I definitely know about jesters.
I don't know if this is a part of your research, but with the demise of Sears and before that Ward's, it's interesting because I was reading some articles about how those two companies specifically helped push or helped create the middle class with good jobs, good pay, good benefits. Did the downtown department stores do the same thing?
Well, I guess I can't be too scholarly about that because I didn't look into the economics like that. But yeah, I'm sure that it did. I'm sure that it did. And you know, in the department stores, they kind of, I mean, I think there were some department stores that some people didn't shop at because they were a little more high priced, and there were some department stores that, you know, like Penny's or, I don't know. Someone's whispering something over there. I'm sure it did. You know, it gave people careers. You know, I mean, I remember I was raised in the military, and when my father got out of the Air Force, the town that we ended up living in, I remember seeing retired military guys, you know, selling shoes in Sears in the downtown of the town that we lived in. I mean, it gave people careers. And careers where they could afford to buy homes and buy cars and put their kids through college. Anyway.
We have a question over here.
Actually, I just wanted to say that the first time I shopped at Dayton's in St. Paul, it was in a little store across the street from where the latest store was. And it was just a small store with wooden floors. And I remember looking at blouses, and they were still in the cellophane packages in rows.
Oh, interesting. Was that between the time when it went from Schoonemann's to building? Because, you know, Dayton's bought Schoonemann's in 1958, and I think they were in that store for, 2 or 3 years before they built the new building.
Well, it's fun to say I'm too young to remember that.
Okay.
And a second thing is that Montgomery Ward still has a catalog. I just got one of their catalogs this week.
Yeah,
in the
they
mail.
started up becoming it's kind of funny, you know, like Montgomery Ward's began as a catalog company, and then it had storefronts, and now it's an internet company. It's kind of things have kind of gone around.
Here we go.
I don't know if everybody knew this or not, but I think it was 1959 and I was in high school, but Dayton's had beginner credit cards so you could build a credit history as a student, and there was a $20 limit on it. But it helped me establish good credit.
Well, that was my first credit card too, except my limit was $50.
There's a question over here, I think, this lady.
Okay. I used to work at Powers in 1961. That's my first job after getting out of the U of M. And what I recall there is, number one, you always had to wear heels, period, if you were, and a dress. And you could never sit down. And they also had a place upstairs with beds so that women, or I assume women, because it was in that area, should rest. You know, there was a line of beds, single beds with a white top on, and let's see what else. And I guess that's about it. Yeah, I was assistant buyer in fabrics after a while.
Oh, you were?
Yes, because I could lift a lot of bolts.
Well, that's
Does anybody remember the low-end department store, Bannon's, and the wall falling down into 7th Street?
I've got it in the book. Yeah, I've got pictures. I don't remember it, but I have that documented.
Could you talk a little bit about it? For those of us who don't remember
Oh,
it.
then I'm going to have to... Hang on. I guess they were taking down part of the building next to the part of the building where the wall fell down, and the front wall fell down. I wish I had it on a slide, but I don't. Nobody got hurt, I do know that. Bannon's, it's St. Paul. Hang on. Sorry, I don't have all this right in my head. As workers prepared to tear down an old building on 7th Street in St. Paul that formed part of Bannon's department store, a 50-foot section of the front wall crashed to the street mid-morning on March 10th, 1950. Workers heard the sounds within the wall, and they knew that something was going to happen, so they got people out of the way so no one was injured. And there's kind of a fun picture. The Historical Society has pictures of this, of police officers carrying birds out of the department store from their pet store.
I have very fond memories of getting a Christmas job at Dayton Southdale and being assigned to the jewelry department. I had never worked any place selling anything. And then they had a piano there and it would play. Does anybody remember that, how nice the atmosphere was? Wonderful.
Okay.
One of my great memories of the mid-50s is coming to downtown St. Paul with my dad on his egg route, and we always went to one department store that I remember, and I remember the guy, and we dropped off eggs for the guy that sold hats in the hat department.
Oh.
And he even came out to our farm to hunt pheasants and drink beer. But
Was that at Dayton's?
That's my question.
Oh, was it in St. Paul?
Yeah, it was Rothschild, so that would be young Quinlan.
Young Quinlan Rothschild, yeah.
Yeah.
And we can't forget the notorious incident at Dayton's, I think it was the mid-'60s, when the bomb went off down in the first floor.
Oh, the St. Paul.
The St. Paul
yeah.
Dayton's, yeah.
I don't have that in my book.
Well, maybe tell us a few details for those.
Well, I don't remember any of the details. I know it was particularly impactful because the one lady that was injured was the mother of one of my high school classmates. That's all I remember, and just vaguely year of mid-'60s.
I think it just kind of had an anniversary sometime in the last couple of years because I remember reading about it maybe last. Anyway.
When did Dayton's buy Hudson's? Because that's a Michigan store, isn't it?
Right. I'm going to have to look that up because I'm not going to get the date right if I don't look it up. I know I should have all this in my head.
No. I mean, it's a lot to have in your head.
Mm-hmm. I think it was in the, I want to say the 80s, but I don't want to have you quote me on that. Hang on.
Okay. Maybe while Krista, you're looking that up, maybe we have another comment here.
Also, speaking about Dayton's, my wife and I happened to be at the Garrison Keillor Prairie Home Companion Show on the Saturday after Marshall Field had bought Dayton's. And those that attended Prairie Home Companion know that Garrison Keillor came out about 15 minutes before the show and would work with the crowd a little bit. Garrison Keillor came out on the stage in his white shirt and his tennis shoes and his red tennis shoes, and the first thing he said was, "Marshall Fields?"
Well, that's funny. I haven't found it yet. Sorry.
Okay, we'll move on to another question. You got to buy the book if you want to find the actual answer.
This is sort of a related story. My brother in about 1965 was on an airplane trip. He was a young business major at the U of M, and he sat down next to an older gentleman, and this gentleman was just, so intent on listening to his whole story and encouraging him, to network and, do all the things he needed to do to be a rising businessman. And then my brother finished. He said, "Oh my gosh, I almost forgot. My dad always told me to get a business card." And so the man hands him his business card, and all it said on it was J.C. Penney Dry Goods.
There's a. The question is, where did the sweatshirt come from?
This year when I went to the History Center to buy your book, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I think
They were selling them. So. And they had T-shirts as well.
So T-shirts and sweatshirts.
Real quick.
Okay.
It was like 78, 79 when they bought Hudson's.
I think I see some hands up over here. First time questioner.
What can you tell us about Herberger's? I went to college in St. Cloud, and I was told that their symbol of a rose was because the original owner of Herberger's wife's name was Rose.
That could be, and I have to tell you that I don't have a chapter on Herberger's in here, and the reason why I chose not to do that was because Herberger's, even though it was founded here in Minnesota, they really never had a flagship store here until way late in their life. I do write about Herberger's a tiny bit in there, but I write about Fandles in St. Cloud, which Herberger's bought Fandles in the 1980s and then destroyed that building and then built their own flagship store in St. Cloud. And I did not really research Herberger's too much other than say where they started. And near Alexandria. Yep. No, they've been around a while, but they never had a big flagship downtown store until they bought the Fandles, which Fandles was founded in like the late 1880s, like a lot of the major department stores. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Well, several things about Dayton's, but one that I remember when I was in junior high, that they would sponsor a program called Glamorama. And that was free, and participants got this hat box. It was a hot pink color, and we'd all traipse up to, I'm not sure, maybe the 8th floor, and they would have, there were just hundreds of girls, all the same age there, and they would have people from the staff teaching about makeup, grooming, and then they, the event you went for 6 weeks, and it would culminate with a fashion show, and they would teach you how to walk like a model and to pivot. And then we all wore an outfit, and I think it was chosen for us, and then of course you could buy it, and parents were invited to come to this fashion show. Well, and I loved this outfit, and we looked at it, and it was out of the budget for my family, but my mother and grandmother sewed, and they found patterns or adapted patterns, so I ended up with the outfit anyway. But so that was nice. My mother also worked for Dayton's, and she worked in the blouse department, and then buyers would let the staff periodically, they would just say, you can choose a blouse to have on display, and monograms were real big then. So then I think the staff would get free monogram blouses. If it had been on display, you either paid very little or you got it free. And at Christmas time, as the employees would come down the elevators, people had to hang their coats. I think it was on the 10th or 11th floor. And there was also a dining room up there, or cafeteria line, where Dayton sold food for their staff for lunches at a very reduced price. And so sometimes when we went downtown, my mother would take my brother and I up there, and that was always fun. But going back to Christmas, when staff came down the elevators, all of the Dayton brothers were down there passing out candy, a box of candy for everyone. So,
which I guess that was something that their grandfather did. He started that.
Okay. Well, they continued it, and it was always appreciated at our house.
I bet.
Thank you.
Okay.
To add to that story, I just want to say that I grew up in Duluth, and I just finished my freshman year at UMD, and I had received a letter from Dayton's inviting me to be part of Dayton's College Board. So I went down to the big city of Minneapolis and stayed at rooming house, or it was more like a dormitory called Mavis Page. They had us stay there. It was near St. Olaf Catholic Church, so we could just walk to Dayton's. And they issued us a lovely outfit to wear. Oh. They issued us a gray flannel shirt, a white blazer, and a red shirt. And our job was to move around to the different departments and work with the salespeople. And then we got to model up on the 8th floor. They had a big style show, and we got to walk down the runway and model. And then I remember also they invited us to go behind the Oval Room, and we got to pick out a formal for ourselves. And I bought, for $14, I bought a gorgeous silk porte-soie, periwinkle blue formal, which I always remember.
You don't still have it?
I did until I lent it to some nieces who I think dressed up in it and kind of wrecked it.
Yeah.
You know, I have a question. I didn't grow up in Minnesota. I grew up in another state where we certainly had department stores, but I could tell from your talk how much more public-spirited department store owners here, in particular the Dayton family, but really all of them. There were no handing out of, backpacks where I grew up. What do you attribute that to? Where does that community spirit come from here in Minnesota and not other places?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. I mean, can anybody here answer that question? I didn't grow up in Minnesota either, I'm afraid, but I don't know. I mean, Minnesota has a reputation for taking care of Minnesotans.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we have that reputation?
Oh, here, take the mic.
I'm not sure how true it is anymore, but it used to be that Minnesotans were considered harder workers and smarter workers. Truly.
No,
they
I know.
go to
No, I
other
know.
states and they would be the first ones hired.
Well, I think
because
North
Minnesotans were
Dakota
known
used to
be
rank
smart.
right up there, too.
And not at all prejudiced in that remark. No self-interest there at all. Okay, there's a question back here.
I grew up in downtown St. Paul and spent many hours in the stores. And one of the things that I still have and use in 1958, so we're talking 60 years ago, I went to Donaldson's and got, for $7, brand new leather Canadian figure skates. And I still skate with them. The last 5 days I've been down at the Landmark Center skating with them. And I even have the box from it.
That's great. I think that's one thing we haven't talked
fabulous.
about is how much these department stores, they sold everything. They sold canoes. Some of them sold guns. They sold toys. They sold washing machines. They sold air conditioners. They sold tools. They sold paint, wallpaper, as well as really fancy clothes.
With all your conversations, did you ever come across the rigorous training that Dayton's had developed, and then just the level of customer service? I had a stint one holiday time in the late 80s just to work Christmas in addition to my regular day job, and I could not believe the extensive training I had to go through to work like a month to sell towels and bedding. But just any information that you came across with that?
I did learn about their executive training. I know I talked with Barbara Armajani, who was the CEO of Powers in the early 1980s, and then, but she started her career at Dayton's. She now owns Ampersand in Edina at the Galleria. I don't know if you know that. But I think she went to college and got a degree in English at a small private school, and she was I guess Dayton's actually looked for students like her, students with history degrees and English degrees, to recruit to come in to work for them. And I guess they had a very rigorous executive training program, and she said that she owes her success to that time at Dayton's and their training. But no, I guess I don't know too much about the temporary salespeople's training.
Other questions from people who haven't asked a question before? Anyone? Okay, anybody got a question? Wait, let me give you the microphone. Is there somebody up here that wanted to speak? Okay.
Hi again. We have a close friend who sewed my wife's wedding dress, but she worked a long time at J.B. Hudson, which I think maybe most of you remember was a little nook corner of Dayton.
Jewelry store.
Before it moved. And she had a number of anecdotes about the travels of the rich, because on certain occasions, J.B. Hudson's wouldn't open. It was closed for the day for a group of women who came in hijabs, and shopped, and their chic was along. They apparently did a lot of catering to the ultra-rich, too, for a minor, quote, minor city. But I suppose they went to Mayo Clinic and J.B. Hudson. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Anybody else? A question, comment? Okay.
That nobody's mentioned. When I was a little girl, we'd go shopping downtown, Dayton's in Minneapolis, and then you would eat lunch. I think it was the 4th floor. And children could get the Tommy Tucker lunch, which was some kind of cream chicken with mashed potatoes and peas, ice cream, and milk. But they had a live orchestra playing, and I remember loving to hear the song for the first time, When the Red, Red Robin Comes Bob, Bob, Bobbing Along. I mean, think about it, that's pretty elegant for having lunch and going shopping.
I'll pass the mic down.
Thank you. I'm so enjoying this, but I have a question for the lady who said she went to school in Duluth and they recruited her to come to do those things at Dayton's, and I was wondering what the follow-up was with that and what they had in mind. Do you know?
At the time, my major at UMD was clothing merchandising, and I think that's why I was selected to go during that summer to Dayton's. Well, when I came back, I had gotten engaged, changed, and I talked to my counselor, and she said, "You can't go into clothing merchandising. You're going to get married. You have to pick education or something." So that was the end of clothing merchandising for me.
Okay, there's a question way back here. Let me walk the mic around. I can see it.
I'm glad times have changed.
In college, I had a roommate who grew up with Bob Dylan's family in the same town, and Bob Dylan's brother was a good friend of hers. So I met him through her, and I remember seeing him play the piano at Christmas time at Dayton's.
Oh, really?
They would have, by the
Oh,
elevator,
wow.
there was a piano play. It was really interesting.
Oh, man. That's a good story.
I remember back in the 50s that Dayton's had what they called a charger plate. And it came in a little case, and it was metal. And it's the first thing I ever saw of any credit cards, or it was not plastic. Yeah, it was old and metal, and my father had a rooming house, so he bought a lot of things in quantity, and so he used that charger plate.
Was he able to use it at other stores too? Because
No, it was the Dayton's charger plate.
Because I have a picture of one that was the St. Paul stores, and you could go to like 5 different stores that had all their names on it.
Well, you could maybe go to Dayton stores, but I think it was just Dayton's. I don't recall it being anything else. And it was this little, it's probably still in the stuff there from my folks, but it was something that I remember from way back when.
There's a lot of memorabilia and a lot of stories and a lot.
Okay, I see a questioner way up front here. Here we go.
You haven't mentioned one of the stores that I shopped at the most, but I'm not a native, and we moved here late, and that was Field Schlick.
I didn't mention it. No, I do mention it in the book, though.
You do? I wondered if you
did.
did.
I did mention that, yeah.
And it was in the Lowry Medical Arts Building. So, of course, it got a lot of doctors' families because they parked in that parking lot. And there was an entrance from the parking lot into Field Schlick that I used frequently because it was such an easy place to shop.
And that must have been a lovely store, too.
It was a lovely store, and we lived in Highland Park. And so there was a branch in Highland Park of the downtown store. And, but it was more specialized. It wasn't as big as I don't think they had household furniture and other things like that. I think it was
clothing and gifts.
Clothing and gifts and
some housewares
and things, yes. But it was a lovely store to
I bet it was.
in.
It sounds like it.
Another perk at Dayton's was in the basement, someone played the piano. They had all of the sheet music. Does anyone remember that? No? You know, it was the era when everybody was required by their parents to take piano lessons. Everyone had a piano. So that was a perk that they had, with someone always playing the music. And then, so I have many pieces of music that are stamped with the Dayton's logo.
That's where you bought your music?
Yes, you bought the music there too. And
guess
then
the
someone played the piano, played whatever the latest things were, songs.
I grew up in St. Paul, so we didn't go to the Minneapolis Dayton's very often. That was like a real big trip. But I do remember going to the book department, which may have been on the 4th floor. It was on a higher floor. And there was also a record department there. And you could go into a little booth and play the record. And all these 45s and LPs. That was pretty neat when you were in high school.
Yeah, I guess Choates and Winona had that too, you know. And even Winona had the little booths where people could go play their records.
Okay, other questions, other memories? Okay, all right, let's see how...
You want me to go through it again?
Who's got their hand up here?
Well, that is an Alexander Calder sculpture that was on Nicollet Mall when Nicollet Mall first opened, and that's Bruce Dayton unveiling it. It's right in front of Dayton's. That's a good question. I think it's at the Walker.
Oh, yeah.
It's at General Mills? Okay, thanks. And this is what I was going to end this on, and the reason why I ended this on this picture, even though it's from 1923, is just looking at all the crowds of people lining up to look at the Christmas windows. I think it just shows you how much what a big deal these departments were for so many people.
I grew up real close to the Southdale area. In fact, we built our house at the same time Southdale was built. So Dayton's was a big part of our life, and I can't remember what year it was. I think it was sometime in the early 1980s the Everly Brothers came. The 25th anniversary for Southdale, and it was in their parking lot. And one other quick thing, I would go to Dayton's shopping using my mother's credit card, and the clerk would call my mother and give permission for me to be able to use the credit card. Times have changed.
Even in the big city. I lived in a smaller town and you could do that, but
well, back to the credit cards. My mother had the metal credit card, and it was in a little blue leather case. But there were notches that you could get on it from other stores. So the more notches that you had on it, the more variety of stores you could shop at. And we had plenty of notches on ours. But so it was kind of interesting that they were all of the charging was communal, really, in
that is interesting, isn't it?
In the downtown.
I wonder how they did that.
Well, my memory of those cards is they had your name and address on them. My memory of those little metal cards is they had your full name and address on
Yeah,
it.
so they just mail the bill to, take a...
It wasn't an account number, it was just you, I think.
I have a picture
Someone
of
else?
one in here.
Okay. Is there a hand up back here? Way back here? Okay, all right.
I'm gonna flash forward pretty far ahead and maybe beyond your research, but I'll throw it out there anyway. You mentioned when Dayton's became Target, and their prototype store was right pretty much where the one is right now. I remember going there. It was a department. It was a retail store connected to a grocery store. So one of the Dayton brothers had a great idea, but they never pursued it. And I've always wondered, did they actually have the concept before Walmart? They just never
Actually,
developed it.
Here's something. Kmart, Walmart, and Target all started the same year.
All right, are there anybody else got, here, okay?
I remember going and shopping with my mother at Dayton's and Donaldson's, and they all had a bargain basement where you got things on sale. So much of what we bought there or at Kresge's.
Yeah, I miss that. I mean, the clearance at Dayton's was just incredible. And their furniture outlet over on Stinson, is that where it was? It was nice. That bargain basement started during George Draper Dayton's time, during World War I, I think.
I was wondering about the Golden Rule and the Emporium. Were they also locally owned?
Yeah, they were St. Paul stores. They were very much locally owned. Oh, my brain is just... The Emporium was actually owned by the Hams family, which is interesting. And then the Golden Rule, I don't have it right in my head who owned that, but the Golden Rule eventually merged with Donaldson's. The Golden Rule and Donaldson's actually both, like in the 1920s or 30s, became part of this allied corporation. So they were individual stores, but they were part of a national organization. And so they actually kind of stopped being locally owned a long time ago, where the Emporium and Dayton's. Powers actually wasn't a locally owned store after about the 1930s either, but.
Somebody mentioned the Target having food in the arena. It wasn't actually Target. They were in partnership with Applebombs.
Oh.
And the food, when they did that jointly.
The grocery was Applebombs?
The grocery was Applebombs.
And now look at him.
Was there
Target's a
question?
grocery store now.
One more story about the Golden Rule. It specialized in uniforms. And so I remember going there for green jumpers, green jackets, green beanies, and green saddle shoes for St. Joseph's Academy. Never forget that.
And I guess that was the place where people bought their kids' piano music in St. Paul.
Any other questions? Okay, well, this has been a great trip down memory lane. We want to thank you very much, Kristal. I think we'll end the program here, but I know that Kristal does have a few copies of her book with her, so if anyone is interested in buying a copy of the book, now would be a good time to step forward. Next week, Ed Lauderman and the Pa-Ingalls syndrome of immigration.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone.